Hey, this is Ben, or Ben, you can call me Bengo. And this is the first overview of the activity pub testing project. We just did like the first release ever, which is just sort of an announcement release, pre-release, check it out release earlier this month. And so I want to tell you about it. There's a couple different components to the project, so that fulfill different roles. So a conformance requirements data set is provided by this ActivityPub behaviors package. Conformance requirements website is provided by activitypub-testing website, which is a reference deployment at .socialweb.coop, the subdomain. Conformance test suite, which is a work in progress, is provided by the activitypub-testing main repo, and there's test cases subpackage, or package export technically. A test runner CLI is provided by activitypub-testing itself, has an executable script that acts as a command line interface so you can use it from a terminal. And the ActivityPub actor tester is the first and only right now web UI, which lets you test an actor and embed that as a widget anywhere you want in any web page with no dependencies, which is pretty cool. Okay, so, and then, the last thing that's not a piece of software, but the last remark is on the test results format. So across all these components, how are we representing the test results? And I call for other projects to consider doing the same. Okay, so first we'll look at the conformance requirements data set, and each component has a video overview. So we'll see that here. ActivityPub behaviors is a data set of behaviors described by the ActivityPub protocol. The protocol describes all kinds of things, some of which are required and some of which aren't. The goal of this repository is to sort of have descriptions of all the things the protocol describes. And a subset of that is the required behaviors, which we can just call the requirements of the ActivityPub specification. And that's what I've been focused on with the testing work so far, is conformance requirements testing. And so that's what's in here. That's what is in here so far. We're looking at the code base. We're looking at the README here, the code on the left, and it rendered nicely on the right. And you can see in the README that there's a bit of an overview of the package, a pointer to the issue tracker, and then a little overview on how you might use this. Now, keep in mind that this is a data set of the conformance requirements. There's not a ton of interesting code in here. The data is what's interesting. But there is a small amount of code which basically which is one way you might want to use this, especially for just exploring the data set or scripting with the data set, which is to basically call it as a script. I'm shipping a lot of the stuff that I write in JavaScript with npm and npx, which comes with this npx command that basically runs the package you name as a script. And so if we do that, we can see how that should print a lot of JSON objects to standard out, and they're new line delimited. So we basically got one line per requirement. It's kind of nice to have new line delimited stuff here for scripting, because you can lop off just the first three or whatever, like this. But most of the time you actually will want to read those behaviors or explore them, in which case you want to use a tool like JQ to pretty print the JSON before you look at it, and then you get something like this. So you can see one of these behaviors looks like this. It's of type behave. It's kind of using JSON syntax in line with the activity streams syntax, and every behavior gets a unique URI as its ID, which is derived from a UUID, which is not a URI, but you might find that useful. And the content of the behavior is sort of just some text summary of the gist. This context talks about where this requirement came from. So the context of this behavior is the ActivityPub spec, specifically certain subsections. And that's more just to sort of help remember where this content came from. And origin is here and is using the web annotation vocabulary to refer to the specific part of the ActivityPub spec that this requirement is kind of justified by or rooted in. And so you can see here that this particular requirement is originating in the ActivityPub spec, this specific section, and this selection of the spec. And it's a selector that selects some text, and then we have here like the exact text that it came from, as well as a prefix and suffix sort of surrounding text, which might help find this text quote selector if the other exact text can't be found. So here you can kind of see that all of these behaviors and requirements are just descriptions of what's already in the spec that is a W3CTR. So that's kind of the easiest way of like exploring this data and proving that it works. Another way someone might want to use that's not like sort of the shell scripting API or the command, that's just is to use it as a JavaScript library. And so that is what these commands show, and we can even like run this real fast if I'm lucky. I have it in my history here. But basically, I'm gonna like import the main script from this package, and you would run this with like more like this import statement otherwise. But when I get it, these are all like the exports of the package, and you can see how I can use like a for loop to say for each behavior in activitypub behaviors, basically log it, and this pretty prints it. And so if I do that, you'll see like sort of similar output to what we saw before, only this is just a for loop. You can do whatever you want here. You can filter, you can do whatever you want. Cool. So that's activitypub behaviors, the data set of specified behaviors from the activitypub spec, including the required behaviors, aka the requirements, and basically we just showed how you can sort of use that data set either when shell scripting via the command I ran before and like parsing it as JSON, or if you are writing JavaScript, you can use it as a library. It should run in the browser as well as the like Node.js or something like that. And this is sort of like the lowest layer of conformance testing, is what are the conformance requirements that we're testing, and that way when something succeeds or fails, we have something to point to as to what succeeded or failed. And that's sort of the lowest layer of activitypub testing. My mic was off for a sec. So that was like the conformance requirements, which is a data set and sort of a library, but is kind of in the weeds. The conformance requirements website renders that to HTML so that it can be deployed to the open web, so anyone can basically read that data set in their web browser. There's a conformance requirements website kind of delivered by activitypub testing. It's in the activitypub testing like main repo. There's this website subdirectory. And so the goal here is I wanted to make sure there was something open source that was kind of a reference example of using the conformance requirements data set to do something useful. Like the data set itself is YAML or JSON. It's kind of hard to explore, so I figured it could be useful to render it to HTML. And then that would make it easier for people who don't really want to wrestle with code or YAML or JSON to make sense out of the requirements data set. So yeah, like I said, this is a subdirectory within the activitypub testing, like main repository. Maybe I'll pull it out at some point. But it's its own little NPM package, and yeah, you can basically run it with npm start, which I did over here. It uses 11D, which is like a static site builder that uses JavaScript. It's kind of like Jekyll or Hugo or many other things. And what that means is then basically this is like an 11D-ism, is there's this like underscore data directory within the package. That's how you use JavaScript to define variables that your templates can use. And so basically this is the file that will define activitypub requirements throughout the rest of this website's like static build. And this is how 11D works, is you can just export a function that will return a promise to the data that should, in your templates, be accessible at this variable. And here you can see I'm importing the library that we looked at before. That's activitypub behaviors that contains the conformance requirements. It gets back an object that has an activitypub requirements property. It's an async iterator, so this basically just like collects them into an array and does some other stuff that isn't that important here. But the main thing is that then in the templates, so I'm going to go to the file in the website directory conformance requirements index. This becomes like the URL at /conformance/requirements. We're using the syntax to generate HTML that's basically saying for each requirement of activitypub requirements. And then each requirement has a UUID, it has a name, it has the content, and it's a JSON object, so we can also just put the raw JSON in here. Anyone could render this however they want. This is just a proof of concept showing how that conformance requirements get rendered from the data set. And this is the thing running right now. The page we were looking at is this one, conformance requirements, and you can see that listing got iterated out, and these are all the requirements we know about. But you can browse them as JSON because of this JSON stringify thing. And yeah, their website also has pages for each requirement itself. So this requirement one is rendered by this template, which is requirement by UUID. And so it says H2 requirement, which corresponds to this. Or the text quote selector, you can see we have prefix, the exact quote selection of the text quote selector, and then the suffix. Well, that turns into this. So this hopefully shows how you can use this as a starting point and render that YAML, JSON, whatever into HTML to help you sort of make sense of it and make other people make sense of it too. And this website, while it's meant to be open source so that other people can do whatever they want with it, the Social Web Co-op's hosting a reference deployment of it that's the same code unmodified. But that way, if you don't want to run your own instance of this, you can always go here, activitypub-testing website.socialweb.coop. I'll try to keep this up to date as we iterate on the website. Great. That was the conformance testing website. And now we should probably look at the test suite itself and the test cases and how they work. Let's look at another part of activitypub-testing, which is in the source directory /activitypub-test. This is the test, what most people mean by test suite. They mean the test cases in the test suite, and that's where these live, the default tests that run with activitypub-testing. Basically, within this activitypub-test directory, each subdirectory within there is a single test rule. They basically all within them have and this is evolving, but I started off making one markdown file per test rule. That's sort of human readable description of what the test is doing, as well as a JavaScript module that corresponds to that basically test specification. And the contents are fairly identical, with the exception that the JavaScript has a function that can run to perform the test on some inputs. After a while, I've started iterating on I started trying to make it simpler because it felt a little redundant. And so now I've also got it so that you can just write a JavaScript file for the test, and things that are more human readable, you can just write in Markdown like this. But there's essentially a well-defined TypeScript type for the test cases, so we get some type checking to make sure everything's consistent. And yeah, you can see what this test case looks like. Every test case has a name, description, applicability, and expectations mean what they mean in the accessibility conformance testing ecosystem, which I will look at in a sec. Every test has a slug, so you can see it in the URL and know which is which. A UID. The tests point or refer to any requirements that they are conformance testing tests for. These use the UUIDs from the conformance requirements dataset. Every test rule has a description of the inputs to that test. So this test that has some expectations, this test which is trying to gather evidence that you've met a requirement about an outbox, takes as input what you would need to identify the outbox being tested. And in this case, the inputs are some outbox URL and an optional input as the authorization you might need to run this rule. There's test cases for the test rule itself. I find this can be extremely useful for testing the edges of the test rule, and they can be kind of hard to set up, but it can be really helpful for every test rule to have an example of something that passes, an example of something that gets other outcomes, inapplicable. And then every test rule has some people that it's attributed to, and then this run function that I mentioned before, which is just JavaScript. And all of this JavaScript is is like should run and will run in a browser as well as Node.js and probably other interpreters. We're basically trying to minimize dependencies here and have this be something someone can just read in a self-contained way. And then every test case directory will also have this other JavaScript file with a suffix like test.js. This is that like the reason it has that file name structure is because that way it gets picked up by the Node test runner, and it uses basically these are Node.js tests for the JavaScript file next to it, and this can do things like set up a mock HTTP server for various situations that the test rule wants to be tested against. So yeah, that's sort of an overview of the conformance tests. They live here in source/activitypub-tests. Every directory within there is a test case, and every test case has a JavaScript representation, tests for the JavaScript. Some have a markdown file that is like kind of hand edited, but for these tests, these are kind of newer ones that don't have a markdown file. If there is a markdown file, it can be used to generate HTML, but if not, the website will generate one for you, or can generate one for you, and it does here. So now we can know enough to know that if we go to all test cases here, and I think the one we were looking at a second ago was this one, this basically is the HTML rendered from that test case JavaScript. And so, for example, the applicability here and the expectations here even in this requirements mapping are all rendered from this test case JS, rendered to Markdown basically. So whereas before you had to, basically you can write a Markdown file that's like the spec for your test, but if you just want to write some code or you're moving fast, you don't want to maintain a separate Markdown file, the website will basically render a web page for your test case, which is kind of nice. Let's talk briefly about applicability and expectations. So all of the tests that I'm including here are a certain kind of test that I have been calling a test rule. And that's after doing a bunch of research and seeing what other people did. And I'm essentially leaning on and reusing a lot of this from the accessibility testing ecosystem at W3C. There's basically this notion of a conformance testing rule. And at first, it can seem a little dense, but it's essentially what you would hope any test suite has, is a bunch of test cases where each test case has some common structure, and every test case has a common identifier, a slug, an author to complain to, and some of the stuff that you might not think of, but I found useful is once you start thinking about testing rules, these tests kind of just become functions with well-defined inputs. The inputs help the test rule identify the test subject, the thing that should be tested, or the test targets. And then if those inputs are gibberish or they're not as expected, a test rule can have many outcomes. One of them might be inapplicable or really anything. But the main thing here is we don't just have passed or failed. A test can run part of the way through, check its inputs, maybe check the network, and then be I don't have enough evidence to tell anything good or bad, so I'm just going to return, and this test is inapplicable in this context. And I hope that can lower the pressure for any one test case to have perfect coverage on things. Is a test rule can be very explicit about the maybe narrow situations in which it applies, and if anything doesn't make sense as it runs, it can basically return this outcome, which is neither a pass nor fail, or requirement satisfaction, or fail satisfaction. It's just I was unable to produce useful conformance satisfaction evidence. So I find this applicability to be really kind of a pressure release valve that any test rule can just end early without delivering a meaningful verdict or anything. And then so applicability sort of processes the inputs, returns early if the test doesn't apply based on those inputs, but otherwise selects some test targets, which are the things that will be checked going forward. And then the expectations are a list of expectations on the test targets that were targeted by the applicability section. Again, it's a little jargon, but I have found it useful to like have some structure here, and that's what I'm going to keep doing. That's the test suite, test rules, and kind of how to find them using the website. Awesome. Next up is the command line interface, which is how you can use a terminal to run, like browse and run all the tests that we just sort of saw the details of. So let's look at the activitypub-testing command line interface. Let's look at the activitypub-testing command line interface. Once you install it, you have this command available called activitypub-testing. And when you run it with no arguments, it prints the help to stand it out. And then you can get some examples of how it can be used, documentation about the options, and some example invocations. Let's just do them one by one. So the first thing is you can get all the tests, and it kind of shows a collection. If you run that, you get something that looks like a collection of tests with a bunch of items, and you can sort of see each test here, including its slug and UUID. If you wanted to like zoom in on a test, you can say activitypub-testing get test by slug. You get something similar, but just for that test case. In this case, you get like the entire markdown representation here, because that's it. Here, but you also get like the type. You get description. This is what you're looking at is like in this case the YAML serialization of the JavaScript file of the test. You can also, like, if you don't want YAML out, you could say, I want JSON, give me that. But YAML's like slightly more readable as the default. So that was getting a single test by slug. We also may want to run a test, which actually is what this example is for. You can also just say test. But this runs a single test by UUID, and then the test that we selected by UUID has an input called object that it requires. And so here we're passing, which is like a string value or a JSON string value. So here we're just like grabbing an example value for that via curl, passing it as input.object, and then running the test. And if we want to see like what does that produce, it logged to standard.io an assertion. The assertion says the test result outcome is passed. The assertion says which test was run, and this is kind of like what we saw a second ago in get test or in the test JavaScript file. It also points, because the test points to any requirements that it's a conformance test for, those get pointed to as well. We have the like concrete input that was passed for this test run to that test is this. So this JSON string is like the result of this shell interpolation. So the test actually ran against that. That way we can make sure it ran against like what we thought it did. And then here we have like a definition of the rest of the terms. So that shows running a single test. And then the real interesting thing is running a mini test against a given actor. And you can just say activitypub-testing, test actor, and then URL to the actor. Whereas the last command ran one test, and so put one assertion to output, this command runs mini tests. So we just saw like mini assertions get written to standard out. You probably want to digest, like make sense of that output by writing a script, or if you're just exploring, like by piping it to JQ like this. And yes, I will make a nicer way of browsing these in the terminal later. But yeah, now we can see that running the test actor command against the co-op URL result like ran all these tests, and we get some outcome passed. We get a different assertion for each of the tests that ran. Cool, so that's like the gist of the command line runner. Frankly, the most often thing I do is to just like test some actor URL. But then if you see something that's unusual or you're iterating on your implementation, it can be useful like while you're focusing on just one test to run a test one at a time. Sweet. Now, so that helps you run the tests from your terminal if you like to use a terminal, but a lot more people will probably be able to use the web browser. So this is another interface to the underlying testing core, which is the web UI called ActivityPub Actor Tester, and it's Notice the syntax there. The command line interface is great for developers or anyone who's comfortable on the command line, but that's not always me. Sometimes I just want to access a web page. And the lower libraries that the command line interface was invoking are all meant to be able to run in a web page anyway, or in JavaScript or in HTML. So it's good to have something that packages that up in a way that it runs in the browser, just so we can test all that. So the ActivityPub actor tester is the name of one of the UIs for this. And I guess I will, let's see, it's its own code repo, so you can see it there. And this is what it looks like. I have it deployed here on the co-op website. And this is basically a user interface for the test actor command that we saw a second ago in the command line interface docs. So basically when you render this, it renders a form that lets you type the actor URL. And in this case, I'll run it against the co-op homepage, and then a big button that lets you test it. And then it runs as many tests as it can against that actor and tries to show the results. So here we can let it green, and then you can hit details to see the underlying test assertion, just like in the command line interface. And if I change this to something else, you can see how that goes. Oh, we get partial results. So one thing that's definitely worth calling out here is when you're running in the web browser, the network requests are subject to cross-origin resource sharing permission. So this network error is actually because Mastodon.social doesn't authorize this origin to make the requests. Note that that didn't result in any failed results or anything, but anyway, it does show it because it is relevant. 2 of the tests did pass, so we can go in and say it was able to fetch the actor object. The course headers apparently allowed that, and it was able to basically fetch the actor object and then pass a test about what the actor object is. It also ran all these other tests, but it didn't pass or fail. It got some kind of inapplicable outcome. And then a handful of tests basically were unable to run and threw some error that wasn't caught because of these CORS errors. All of that's somewhat normal when running in a web browser where the web browser is controlling your access to the network. But hey, we still got 2 green check marks, so that's great. What's really cool though is that this isn't just Slim UI that is on the co-op website. This is a custom HTML element. And so let's see, if we look at the source code of this web page, there's a bunch of CSS, sorry. But then what actually rendered there was this ActivityPub actor tester. And this attribute said test right away. And then this attribute is a relative URI reference to the actor that should be tested, which in this case resolved to socialweb.coop at the root, /. But it could be an absolute URI as well. So what that means though is that actually ActivityPub actor tester is something that can be embedded anywhere. It's like a widget. So to prove that, this is the source code for the ActivityPub actor tester. And in the examples directory, I have this HTML file, which shows how you can basically use this public CDN for NPM packages to embed ActivityPub actor tester's element definition with a integrity check, which is great, and then use it here. So even notably, this isn't using any of the local source code. It's fetching a certain release off of NPM by way of a CDN. But when this runs over here, this tab, this is just served via a static web server, and it all works. So you can see how that script tag is all self-contained. Basically, you should be able to embed something like this on your site and have the same access to the web UI. Cool. Go try that out. Try to embed it on your site. Okay, the last sort of little module here is talking about the test result format that you might have seen in JSON format throughout all the other videos. We talked about the test runner, and we talked about the test cases. And the last thing I just want to end with is some focus on the test results format. This is because this is something where other projects are welcome and encouraged to interoperate with activity web testing and with other tools as well, where even if there's other testing projects out there that are testing other behaviors, even other protocols, or even other things that aren't even specified anywhere, any test can be thought of as producing an assertion like this, and if we all cooperate to produce the same test assertion format, then users of our respective testing tools will benefit, or could, because they will not have to translate test results back and forth, or have testing tools that only work with the out results of one tool. But we can actually get a bit of a testing ecosystem that's bigger than any one test runner, potentially even bigger than ActivityPub, and start to build just better web testing ecosystem. So I'm not saying you have, I didn't just make up a thing for you to use. What I did was some research to figure out what other people did. And I found that the accessibility conformance testing ecosystem at W3C, which defined this accessibility conformance testing rule format, this spec has an appendix 1, which talks about describing rule results in a JSON format. So this is what I've tried to stick to, essentially. Reusing this assertion term. Every assertion points to the test that it ran, as well as the result of running that test. This appendix doesn't reify the input that was passed to that test, but that's what I did, is put it here, as with input having same sort of definition as this prose in the text. And so, yeah, I just like the accessibility conformance testing ecosystem has apparently found it useful to represent test results as these assertion JSON objects. I did too. And so activitypub-testing produces the same underlying data. It's very similarly shaped in JSON, mapped to the same ontology underneath. And I really encourage other projects to do the same. So yeah, basically write a program, or have your testing tool support some export format, which is either JSON or new line delimited JSON, and where each JSON object has type assertion, points to the test at least by URI, if not some extra information about the test. If it's a conformance test, it can point to the requirements that it's testing conformance to. But just any URI is better than no URI for the test. And this is how I point to the input that can be run. And yeah, let's all reuse this prior art. Awesome. Okay, so there's no last slide. But thanks if you've watched this far for seeing all the parts, including the boring last part. And email ben@bengo.co if you have any questions. Bye.